First of all, I want to thank the organizers of this highly intellectual symposium for accepting my presentation. I think that this is one of the highest honors because you guys, you keep the Russian culture alive, disseminating it all over the world. I think you are doing an excellent job. And my topic is Ayn Rand and her philosophy in her ego documents. Ayn Rand was a famous novelist and philosopher. I don't know if everybody is familiar with her name. That's why I'm going to give you a short glimpse to her life with the major events so that you know who I'm talking about. She was born in St. Petersburg in 1905 in a well-to-do Jewish family. She went after 1917, after the St. Petersburg University became available to women. She attended St. Petersburg University and studied the philosophers, major philosophers, Aristotle, Plato, and Friedrich Nietzsche. After graduating from the university, she worked in a museum as a museum guide. And then she studied for a year at the State Institute of Cinematography in Leningrad. She also published a first book about Paula Negri, who was her idol. Paula Negri, a famous silent movie Hollywood star. And that was her first publication. But her dream was Hollywood. So in 1926, she came for a visit to the United States and stayed with her relatives in Chicago first. And after obtaining a reference letter from one of the friends of her relatives to Hollywood, she left for California and arrived to the mansion of Cecil DeMille, who was a titan of Hollywood movies. For 3 years, she worked as a housekeeper in his estate and also worked at the Department of Wardrobe in Hollywood, which allowed her to work on scripts. In 1927, she was engaged as an extra on the set of the film The King of Kings, produced by Cecil DeMille. And there she met an actor, Frank O'Connor, whom she married and changed her name to Alice O'Connor. She was born as Alisa Zinovievna Rosenbaum. That was her name registered in the Soviet Union. But then she changed this name to Alice O'Connor. And later, she assumed the pen name of Ayn Rand. When she was asked a question, why that name, she explained that that was just a whim of her fantasy. And Ayn came from the Finnish female name Aina, but she cut the last letter and turned it into Ayn Rand. She enjoyed working in Hollywood, and she presented already a few scripts which she managed to write. Her dream was to become famous in the United States, and she surely achieved that dream, whatever it cost. She became a famous author. This is a list of her works. With the Living, The Romantic Manifesto, The Fountainhead, Atlas Shrugged. Some of her works are translated into Russian. Most of her works have been translated into other world languages. And besides, she wrote articles, multiple articles in periodicals. She led the Objectivist newsletter from 1962 to 65. And of course, the most important documents that she left behind were her letters and her, like in the first slide, I showed her letters and her journals. Her letters and her journals. Okay, These are the most famous works that influenced the thoughts of most Americans. The Fountainhead and Atlas Shrugged. So what were the kernels of her philosophy? When she came to the United States, she was fueled by the negative experience living in the USSR. She put it as negative experience, though she got her education at St. Petersburg University. St. Petersburg University, and used her knowledge that she acquired there. But mostly she achieved her success due to her indomitable drive and perseverance. She defined individualism in her book Atlas Shrugged like that. My philosophy is the concept of man as a heroic being with his own happiness as the moral purpose of his life, with productive achievement as his noblest activity, and reason as his only absolute. She had a lot of followers. One of her followers was Alan Greenspan, the future chairman of the US Federal Reserve. He was a member of the society that she created, Philosophical Society, where they were discussing and disseminating the ideas of individualism and objectivism. That's how she called her theory. And in this picture, you see her in the White House next to the President of the United States, and Alan Greenspan, who was sworn as chairman of the Federal Reserve and Council of Economic Advisors. Not only Alan Greenspan was her follower, there were a lot of other famous statesmen and famous, well-accepted people in American society who followed her ideas and thought that she was right in everything she said. But there were also those who were against her teachings. Such people, famous also people as Gore Vidal and Dorothy Parker, who said about her novel, it is not a novel that should be thrown aside lightly. It should be thrown with great force. And Gore Vidal said, this odd little woman is attempting to give a moral sanction to greed and self-interest. Rand's philosophy is a form of egoism. She argues that self-interest is moral and that altruism is immoral. So you see that the figure of Ayn Rand and her persona was very controversial, And it became more controversial after the scandalous affair that she had with her young student. So in 1950s, Rand met with a college student named Nathan Blumenthal. Here he is. And his young wife. In this picture, you see Nathan Blumenthal, his wife, Barbara. This is Ayn Rand, and Ayn Rand's husband, Frank O'Connor, who was an actor. Okay, so he was also an actor and an artist. And Ayn Rand started an affair with Nathan Blumenthal in front of their spouses. And she said that, oh, they have to be, we have to be honest. We have to be honest and we have to tell them. Yes, she was pursuing her ego, her desires. But what about the other people around her? Her selfishness, no sympathy, no compunction, no compassion to the people who loved them. So that was the real proof of her theory of egoism and individualism. That was this affair marked a negative line under her career, under her literary career. So most of this all these significant events were documented in her letters and in her journals. Now we come to the letters. The first letter that she wrote from the United States was to Lev Beckerman in 1926, the year when she arrived in the United States. That was the only letter that she wrote in Russian and the only letter that was handwritten. So in this letter, she wrote that, oh, you wanted to correspond with an American? I'm totally Americanized now. I can walk in the streets of New York and not look at the skyscrapers. So I can sit at the on the high stool at the bar, and a real Negro brings a cocktail with a straw to me. So those were the significant signs for her, which seem very mercantile from the point of view of today. So in this letter, she also said, if you decide to come to the United States, I will gladly meet you. Even if you arrive in 1947, I will gladly meet you, because I don't want you to be embarrassed by the media and by the photographers who will take pictures of me, because by 1947, I will be very famous. And she achieved her dream. She became extremely famous. Her first book was We the Living, which came out in 1934. It was a depiction of daily Soviet life. She wrote a letter. Totally, I want to mention that totally she wrote 2,000 letters. She wrote 2,000 letters because she believed, in one of her journals she wrote, only a language can be a means of communication between people and the means of understanding. And she implemented this principle in full by writing letters to anybody who could be instrumental on her road to success. She wrote letters to actors and producers, senators and attorneys, movie directors and scriptwriters, playwrights and literary agents, to newspaper editors and politicians, literary critics and statesmen, to Supreme Court justices and to the clergy. Altogether, she wrote, as I said, 2,000 letters. By connecting all those people, she skillfully navigated among their diverse opinions, using their privileged positions to ask for positive reviews of her books and to win their support. So, as she comes out to the reader and to the viewer, to today's viewer, she was bold, outspoken. In her letters, she approved of those who objected to the recognition of the Soviet Russia and appealed to their political interest of fighting communism, drawing them on her side to help her launch her philosophy by helping with publishing her literary works. So in the letter to Alexander Kerensky, she wrote, of all the great Russian people in the world, your opinion is the most valuable to me, and I have waited for the opportunity to send you this book for a long time, since I started writing it. I lived in Russia for many years under the Soviet regime, and I think that a depiction of daily Soviet life will probably be of interest to you. Brazen may be the right word to describe her intent to show a better way to live one's life than in the collectivism society. Using the modality of letters, she invited an open political discourse. She didn't shy away from notoriety. She didn't care much about the negative resonance of her ideas. By that, she succeeded in attracting attention to her persona as an author of the new ideology. She called it, as I said, objectivism, a philosophy of rational individualism. She courted controversy to be in the center of the social polemics. In her journals and in her letters, she explained, defended, interpreted, extenuated, vindicated, and exonerated her concept of individualism, a leitmotif of all her literary works. The morality of individualism, she wrote, is superior to that of collectivism. Individualism is a completely new faith, as a religion, as a code. The morality of individualism is superior to that of collectivism again. In fact, the only morality worthy of the name, then quoting Nietzsche, she writes in her journals about the notion of free will, not freedom from what, but freedom for what. So thus we see that by writing those letters, not only she confirmed her credo, but she also widened and expanded the sphere of her influence, of the influence of her ideas. Leo, her first boyfriend who stayed in Russia, represented her idea of a romantic hero in that time. He became a model for the main hero in this novel, We the Living, Leo Kovalevsky, the main character in her novel. And this novel reveals the hardships and miseries that she experienced with her family while living in the Soviet Union, living under the slogans of collectivism, with propaganda fed to them until they mentally suffocated. In 1936, in her journals, she wrote, "If one takes even the swiftest look at the world today, one cannot help but see the greatest, most urgent conflict of our times, the individual against the collective. The problem interests me above all others in my writing. No country on earth offers such a startling and revealing view of that conflict as Soviet Russia, hence With the Living. The plot of my novel is entirely fictitious. The background and the circumstances which made the plot possible are entirely true." So she also addresses Henry Mencken, a famous philosopher and writer in the United States at that time. She writes to him, and we know why, because both of them adored, admired, and revered Friedrich Nietzsche. She wrote about this book. "I'm sure you understand that my book is not at all a story about Russia, but a story of an individual against the masses and the plea in defense of an individual. Your favorable opinion of it was particularly valuable to me, since I have always regarded you as the foremost champion of individualism in this country." She knew well what they had in common, as I said, the reverence of Friedrich Nietzsche. Ayn Rand ideals had been long time ago focused on the Western philosophy, especially of Nietzsche, ultimately summarizing her literary heroes. She first read Nietzsche in 1920 when she was only 15. And later in an interview in 1961, she says, "I was very curious to read him. I learned a lot about his philosophy, about his ideas, but I became increasingly interested in creating my own etalon of morality, opposing that of collectivism, first-hand experienced by me while living in the Soviet Union." So all those qualities of compassion, pain, love, symbol of man are referred to by Nietzsche for weakness. Egoism and hatred are elevated to an honorable pedestal. The name Superman, which must be ours, our pride, our most complete self-denied and destruction. There is no doubt that there are two basic beings in man, that of the beast and that of the superhuman described by Nietzsche. I do not want and cannot oppose them to each other. So we understand that Nietzsche played a great role in her career and in her development as a writer, as a philosopher. In 1936, she wrote 2 letters to John Temple Graves, syndicated columnist from Birmingham, Alabama, and that's what she said. Graves wrote a review of her book, With the Living, And he said that with the living was not merely an argument against communism, but against all forms of collectivism, against any manner of sacrilege toward the individual. She responded as follows: "It would be easier for me to conceive of tolerance toward a theory preaching a wholesale execution of mankind by poison gas than to understand those who find any possible ethical excuse for destroying the only priceless possessions of man and his individualism. After all, any form of swift physical annihilation is preferable to the inconceivable horror of a living death. And what but rotting alive can human existence be when devoid of the pride and the joy of the man's right to his own spirit?" That was in 1936. A month later, in August, she writes another letter to the same columnist, and she stated her point of view regarding a society. "As witness of Soviet Russia, I cannot get away from the idea that society as such does not exist apart from its members. It is not a separate mystical entity. We have a society where everyone sacrifices. Just exactly who profits and who is happy? A happy collective composed of miserable, frustrated members is an absurdity." She comes up with the opposite: a society of individuals with egoistic interests. These were the years, 1930s, the years, as everybody knows, where the fascist multi-headed Hydra was raising its heads in Europe. And With the Living was published in 1937 in Italy, where fascist was blooming at that time, translated in Italian and published in Italy. And a year later, there was a movie made based on this book. This movie was circulated all around Europe in the countries as the fascist propaganda. Interesting that only in 1946 she wrote a letter to her attorney saying that she will file a lawsuit against the Italian movie company who used her book as the fascist propaganda without paying her tribute, financial tribute. The dates are really interesting, and I attract your attention to this. Only in 1946 he wrote this letter. She was considering the financial side. So in her journals, this is how she described the moral basis of individualism. Altruism is the doctrine which holds that man must live for others and place others above self. Humanity has proclaimed its moral idea unanimously. But look back at humanity's record. Every major horror of history was perpetrated, not by reason of and in the name of what which men held as evil, that is selfishness, but through, by, for, and in the name of an altruistic purpose. The Inquisition, religious wars, civil wars, the French Revolution, the German Revolution, the Russian Revolution. No act of selfishness has ever equaled the carnages perpetrated by disciples of altruism. Nor has any egotist ever roused masses of fanatical followers by enjoining them to go out to fight for his personal gain. Every leader gathered men through the slogans of a selfless purpose, through the plea of their self-sacrifice to a high altruistic goal, the salvation of other souls, the spread of enlightenment, the common good of their state. At the apex of every great tragedy of mankind, there stands the figure of an incorruptible altruist. Yet, after every disaster, men have said The ideal was right, but Robespierre was the wrong man to put it into practice, or Cromwell, or Lenin, or Hitler, or Stalin. Isn't it time to question that noble ideal instead and proclaim egoism and individualism? That will be all. Thank you. Thank you for your attention. This is bibliography, and thank you.